All right, guys, it's crazy, but the good times, the good television times, I should say, keep on rolling because right after The Penguin ended, it's basically zero break. We went from the finale to The Penguin, and then HBO decided, you know what, you deserve some more good TV. And so, literally, the next week, when a Penguin episode 9 could have come out, we get Dune Prophecy episode 1. So much good television to talk about. This is going to be a spoiler discussion of episode 1 of the new HBO series. Dune Prophecy, obviously in the same franchise as the recent Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 films from Denis Villeneuve. So really excited to be able to talk about a new series that I hope will be just as good, if not better, than The Penguin. But honestly, it doesn't have to compare to The Penguin. Just, a really good television show would be awesome here as well. So this is your spoiler warning. If you have not seen episode 1 of Dune Prophecy, make sure to save this video, save this podcast, save this segment to watch later, and then come back once you have seen the first episode of Dune Prophecy. Guys, let's get into this. It's a new show. So right off the bat here, because this is a newer show, right? A new, and even though it's part of the Dune franchise and I'm a little bit familiar with the Dune lore, it's still, you still have to get used to new characters and figure out new names and new planets and all these other things that are going on here. And so just to give a little bit of a background here, just as I did in my immediate reaction to episode 1 of Dune Prophecy, this is sort of my familiarity with the Dune franchise. I have read the first 2 books, Dune and Dune Messiah. I also, and obviously Dune, the first Dune book having been the adaptation of the, Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2 of the movies, and then Dune Part 3 is going to probably be Dune Messiah, so there's that. And other than that, I don't really have an extensive knowledge of Frank Herbert's lore, and, other than what the books have said, because the movies don't really have time to delve into the Machine Wars and the Orange Catholic Bible and all these other things that have gone on. And so it may not be obvious, right, to people who have just seen Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, but Dune, the films Dune, take place thousands of years after our modern times. People may not have even known, in fact, that the Dune franchise takes place in a futuristic world that is supposed to be our universe and our world. I actually, when I first started reading Dune, I had kind of assumed that it was just an alternate universe or whatever. But it turns out that Dune takes place in a very, very, very distant future. And so Dune Prophecy picks up immediately. We get that little text after the prologue that this takes place 10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides. And so we definitely have a lot of space to work with here, which I think is really exciting because, this is something I've said about Star Wars, right? And that Star Wars has the same room as a franchise like Dune to maneuver around and do what it wants, in a space like this, which I think is exciting, for this kind of franchise. So, there is that. So as we begin this episode, and I always like to do a kind of breakdown of the episode, I took some notes as always, and just trying to, get the best, understanding of the episode as we're going along, and want to convey to you my experience of watching this episode kind of in real time. But, before I even started the episode, I was thinking, okay, so I'm really, I'm kind of curious, right, to see how this show does or does not fit into the movies, right? It has the visuals of the Dune franchise, just even right off the bat, it has pristine visual quality and just very intentional shots and great CGI on the planets and things like that. But really curious, how is this going to fit into the overarching Dune storyline? So we immediately start off this story. It's being told from the perspective of a Harkonnen. Now, this is Valia Harkonnen, as we're introduced to her. But it was interesting because as I was watching, it was like, why is the woman's voice, I was presuming a little bit older when we're getting this younger Valia Harkonnen who is much younger, who has a much younger voice, right? And so I was like, okay, interesting. So this is being told in retrospect. And I kind of figured that they were going to do a little bit of a prologue here and then skip ahead in time. It is customary with a franchise like Dune, with a series or a movie set in this universe, that there are a lot of names. There are tons of names to go through. And so even I was sort of getting a little bit confused, and as someone who is familiar with the Dune lore, the Bene Gesserit, the Harkonnens, and the Atreides, and Fremen, and Seleucus Secundus, and all these other things, even I was getting a little bit confused. But what I think this show does a really good job of, actually, I hope, you'll have to let me know in the comments down below if you haven't seen any of the Dune movies, if you have only seen the Dune movies but haven't read the books, if the names were confusing, if the planets were confusing. I'd love to hear actually a variety of different perspectives, even from people who have read all the Dune books, because I think that for me, as somebody who is not a diehard, hardcore Frank Herbert, Dune fan, I still really appreciated what was going on. But just like how I had the experience when I first read the Dune book, it was a bit dense and a bit confusing at first, but eventually you kind of get on board and you kind of understand what's going on. So we start out here with this mother, right? This is the, I forget the exact title here, but the what Lady Jessica becomes, I guess, later on in Dune Part 2, and her name is Raquel. And so this is now they're going through this narration of explaining what the Bene Gesserit breeding program is, which is, it's pretty messed up, right? I mean, there's an acknowledgement here that it is a very messed up thing, that they're trying to control the bloodlines and, get the right leaders on board. It's a very messed up program here. And what's interesting is that it seems like the crux of this show is that they want a sister, a sister of the Bene Gesserit to be on the throne eventually, which is, I guess, their hopes are on Inez. And so we'll have to see where that goes there. Also very interesting that the mother of the sisterhood is a Harkonnen. I wonder if that will play out. Again, if you know the answers to these, because if this is based on some prequel book that Frank Herbert wrote, I don't know any of this, so I'm just going off of what I know. That's why I give the context earlier. But I think it's really interesting that we're focusing in on a Harkonnen. We also get an Atreides later on, and we get plenty of references to Arrakis. So as I said in my immediate reaction, this isn't, obviously this takes place 10,000 years before Paul Atreides, but there are plenty of commonalities, common markers between the franchises, right? Between the different points in the franchise. Fremen are referenced, Arrakis. You obviously see sandworms, which look the exact same as they do in Dune. You obviously have the Emperor. Seleucus Secundus, for those of you who don't know, is where the Sardaukar, the Imperial guards from Dune, are trained, and all these different things, right? All these things that are connecting to one another. And the Harkonnen, obviously Valia and Tula Harkonnen are on top in terms of the Bene Gesserit, so that's really interesting. So yes, we're following a younger Valia Harkonnen, and then we get to see. So the mother sees a vision. She sees a sandworm, and she sees a massive sandworm. By the way, it's a crazy sandworm that kind of swallows up a whole city, or a whole building, and then she dies. So I guess before she dies, she gives a warning to Valia, and she's basically like, there's going to be a tyrant, and there's going to be a sandworm, and all these kinds of things. It's a little vague, it's Dune prophecy, right? So a lot of these things are based on things that they're expecting to happen in the future. A little bit vague, but we'll have to see how that plays out. I don't know what tyrant she's referring to. Maybe Paul. I don't even know. But that's interesting. And so then she gives the succession of the motherhood to Valia Harkonnen, which is not quite popular, as we'll see very soon. And Valia makes it very clear that she wants one of the sisters to rule the Imperium. And so then we get this confrontation between a character named Dorothea, I think, who is very opposed to this, and she pays with her life because the voice, right? It seems like this is one of the origins of the voice, where Valia is using the voice here to basically murder a sister, and that is crazy. It was quite unexpected, and so but I think I was not, let me say this, I was not too convinced by the younger Valia, because at first I was like, is this the character that we're going to be following? She didn't quite have that presence that I think a character like Rebecca Ferguson had in Dune, for example, as part of the Bene Gesserit. But I think that seeing the factions within the sisterhood was really interesting, and seeing how the young Valia played within, her coldness, right? Her willingness to use the voice to murder the other sister. But I think that I was a little bit, not sold, I guess, on this younger version of Valia. Now, the Emily Watson version, the older version that we're following in the main timeline, I guess, the present day timeline, I was much more convinced about. I was like, okay, this is a character that I think knows what she's doing, but I think is also blindsided by ambition. I think is much more convincing to me as a character. But anyways, we'll get there in just a second. So they talk also about this breeding index, right? Which I guess is sort of their key to their power of, knowing which bloodlines they want to mix. And again, it's messed up. There's an acknowledgement here that it's a completely messed up thing, but this is sort of what the Bene Gesserit are doing. And this is why they were so mad at Lady Jessica, because they had this whole program ready, and then Lady Jessica decides, no, I'm gonna give birth to the Kwisatz Haderach, or however you pronounce it, Paul Atreides, right? So yeah, really interesting stuff. Honestly, I mean, even at the beginning, right, when we're still setting up stuff, I was still like, there's a lot of intrigue going on here, and I was very curious to see what was going on. So anyways, like I mentioned, Valia uses the voice to murder Dorothea, and that was, very vicious. It was almost like a Sophia Falcone kind of moment. I was kind of wondering, is this going to kind of parallel Sophia in that way? Or are we going to follow a character that, we're kind of rooting for, but also is very morally ambiguous? It's probably the case, who's quote unquote doing the right thing, but doing the wrong thing. We'll have to see about that. So yeah, it's a lot of just trying to get your bearings, especially in this prologue section here. And we skip forward 30 years later. It's, 10,000 years before Paul Atreides, and here we go. So we get now a little bit more context here, right? So the princess's half-brother is preparing the princess to come to the sisterhood. He's creepy. He's very creepy. I don't like this character at all. Constantine is his name. Yeah, I don't... Something suspicious about him. I really don't like him at all. And I wonder if he has a bigger role to play later on in the show. He's just a little creepy. But anyways, the space visuals are very good as we see spaceships flying to Seleucus Secundus, which is, where the Emperor is and where the Sardaukar will be. And, Constantine and the princess, they meet up, Princess Inez, and yeah, I mean, they just have a very, very weird relationship. I don't like it. It's just creepy. I know I've said that, but yeah, just creepy. We get introduced also to the swords master who, I forget his first name, but he was an Atreides, because later on, I think in the episode, they mentioned that this guy is an Atreides. So very interesting there. And, with what happens between the swords master and Inez later on in the episode, I wonder if that, because this is a breeding program, I wonder if, again, keeping the channel family friendly, but I wonder if this has some implications for what the Bene Gesserit were going to do, and maybe they didn't want this, and now there's going to be a whole wrench thrown in their plans. Seems like at the end of episode 1, a lot of wrenches are being thrown in Valia's plans, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes in episode 2. So anyways, we're introduced to Mark Strong here, and yeah, I mean, it's also interesting as, this other guy who ends up being the father of that 9-year-old boy who marries, or I guess was going to marry Inez. Now we'll see what happens with that. But this guy is talking about Arrakis, and he's like, hey, just so you know, Emperor, you still have all these problems with the Fremen on Arrakis and all these sorts of things. It's interesting, right? Because it's interesting to think about 10,000 years before the events of Dune, that the Emperor is still having pretty much the exact same problems on Arrakis 10,000 years ago. Quite interesting. I wonder if that'll play a part in, maybe that'll, explain something or the other, but yeah, we'll have to see about that. Then we get back to Wallach 9, which is where the Bene Gesserit are training. It's very Jedi Temple-like, kind of indoctrinating kind of stuff, but also very regimented and a lot of intense training. We get kind of a little bit of a subplot here. I think that is also very interesting. So then we get introduced to a character named Desmond Hart, who I was not expecting at all to be that important. I just thought, oh, this is just a guy from Arrakis, kind of like a Jason Momoa Duncan Idaho or Gurney Halleck, but no, he becomes very important later on, and I guess he's the villain of the series. We'll have to see about that. But new subplot, because he discusses an attack on the Imperium, and he says it was not from the Fremen, but it was from allied houses. And now I'm suspecting that somehow he was able to lie, because was it Kasha? Was that the sister's name that who died at the end of the episode? I think she says that he's telling the truth. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll have to see, because somehow he got out of telling the truth, or he did tell the truth or something, because it seems like he was lying now. But yeah, he basically tells the Emperor that these attacks on the house Carino, that the Emperor is part of, was attacked by allied houses and not by the Fremen. So it's really, really interesting. We're also introduced to this idea that Inez is going to be married to that little boy, and it's political marriages, and also just more exposition about the fact that the Emperor himself was married to his wife for political reasons, very similar to how Irulan, Florence Pugh, is being married to Paul Atreides for political reasons, but Zendaya's character Chani is obviously Paul's true love and all that sort of stuff. It's really interesting, right? I think if you read the Dune books, and you can get a lot out of just the fascinating intrigue and the different espionage aspects and betrayals and house lineages, and it is very Game of Thrones-ish, I will say. And so then we get more scenes between Tula and Valia as they're kind of scheming about the right pairing and preparing for the princess to come to Wallach 9 to become a part of the sisterhood. Should be interesting. I wonder if that's still going to happen based on what happens at the end of this episode with the prince or the little boy dying and also the sister dying, but we'll see. We'll see about that. And then, yeah, the sister who was Kasha, I think is her name, who was bonded with Inez, is just convinced that they're heading down the wrong path. And, Tula and Valia are not believing her, but turns out she was absolutely right, and she pays with her life for that. And yeah, really, really scary. And she sees a really interesting vision. I wasn't able to quite get every single shot or, figure out exactly what was going on here. Maybe I'll have to look back on it. I'm sure there are going to be breakdown videos that explain exactly every single shot that was going on there. But yeah, I'm curious to see how much of it actually pays off later on in a real, tangible way. So then we get this wedding from the Richese house, which is where the little boy comes from. And I mean, it's creepy. It's supposed to be creepy, but just seeing a 9-year-old, I think they say it's 9 years old, 9-year-old boy marrying a young woman, it's weird. And I I'm sure it's supposed to be weird, but it is weird. I just have to point that out. Anyways, yeah, so we're still getting a lot of this build up, and I said here in my notes at this point that there does need to come a point where this show has to take off. But for the time being, I think that I was just still very on board with all the world building that was going on, and we'll see where we go from there. So we get the wedding scene, and then this boy has this kind of robot lizard thing, and I was a little bit confused about that. I was like, why is everyone freaking out about this? But then they explain that this is a thinking machine because they had just finished up the war with the machines, and obviously that was the big impetus for all the factions and all the wars and whatnot. And so obviously if that is going to be playing a part in the series, you obviously would be very suspicious of a faction of a house that still has these machines. So I think that is really interesting. Just another layer on top of all the the interesting politics that are going on here as well. Then Desmond talks to the Emperor and kind of talks about the gods, which is really interesting. I'd never really heard about the gods in this Dune franchise, so I wonder what that's gonna happen there. And then we get into, I guess, Inez wants to go party, and so this is the first mention, I think, where the swordsman is called an Atreides. So I think that was my first clue of very interesting. And yeah, again, keeping the show family friendly, but you know what happens next if you've seen the episode. And I think that's interesting because I wonder if that has anything to do, again, if that thwarts what's going on with the Bene Gesserit and whatnot here. I wonder, because I think that is all going to be very interesting. And I think that these things are going to tie together. Or even just the fact that there's a romance between the Atreides and the Corino, I think it's Corino line. And it was supposed to be with that little boy and his family line, but we'll see. We'll see where that goes. Also, the fact that they're leaning way more into this idea of, I think it was spice that they're using, spice is a drug, because that's really what it is. I mean, they don't really touch on it in the movies, but spice is a drug, basically. And that it's way more obvious in the books as well, but I guess I don't know. I guess they're touching on this more in the series, which is interesting. So then the Emperor wakes up and he sees, I guess he sees a sandworm, and I wasn't able to tell if that was Desmond, but it's kind of being intercut with the fact that Desmond reveals himself to be the villain. I guess can he control sandworms or what? I'm still confused about what happened there on Arrakis, but then he just basically kills the child, and he kills Kosh. I literally, it's all the names. I need to get all the names straight before episode 2. But he kills the Bene Gesserit sister, and it looks like he's the villain of the show. I don't know why. I'm sure we'll get an explanation as to why, and I'm sure Arrakis will be a very important part of it, just as it was last time. Last time being Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2. And that's the end of the episode, guys. I think, look, like I said, based on this spoiler discussion as well, I hope it's evident. There's a lot of setup going on here. But I think all of it's really interesting, and I think with a show like this that has so much intrigue, I think that setup is necessary. I do. I think that if every single episode is like this and there's just no payoff, I think it's not going to be worth it. But I think for now, I'm super on board with this. Again, this is not the best episode I've ever seen of television. It's not like the Penguin episode 3 or episode 4. It's not even like the Penguin episode 1, which the Penguin episode 1 itself, I was like, whoa, this is different. We're going. This episode is not like that, but I think that it's setting up a different kind of show with a very, similar kinds of characters, right? With characters that are morally ambiguous. Like Inez, I think, has her own ulterior motives or her own interests, and obviously Valia Harkonnen has her own interests, and the Emperor has his own interests, and I think that's all going to play a big part into how this series is going to go. So guys, what did you think about episode 1 of Dune Prophecy? Did you enjoy it? Are you on board? Maybe not on board? Let me know in the comments down below. What are you looking forward to in the coming episodes? And yeah, let me know what you're excited about. I'm excited about the next couple episodes and the rest of the series, and I hope you guys are as well. Let me know in the comments down below.